Dinner was almost ready when my daughter-in-law walked into the room. The table was already set, plates aligned, glasses filled halfway. Everything looked polite, organized, normal. I stood there for a moment, holding the napkins I had folded myself, waiting for someone to tell me where to sit. No one did. My daughter-in-law glanced at the table, then at me. She smiled, not a warm smile, not a cruel one, just efficient. "You can sit here." She pointed, not to the table, to a chair near the corner, slightly away, close enough to be present, far enough to be separate. The chair didn't face anyone directly. It faced the wall. For a second, I thought I'd misunderstood. Maybe it was temporary. Maybe someone was still moving plates around. Maybe she meant, for now. But no one corrected her. My son didn't look up. He was already seated. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, not sadness. Confusion. The kind that arrives before pain knows what shape to take. I stood there, still holding the napkins, waiting for someone to laugh it off. No one did. My daughter-in-law was already turning back to the kitchen. The conversation resumed as if nothing had happened, as if that small gesture hadn't just rearranged the room. I walked to the chair she had pointed at. The floor felt colder there. I sat down carefully, smoothing my skirt, reminding myself to breathe normally. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was just a seat, that grown women don't get offended by furniture. But the way the chair had been placed, slightly angled, slightly away, made it impossible to join the conversation without raising my voice. So I stayed quiet. The voices at the table overlapped. Laughter came easily. Plans were discussed. Names were mentioned. Decisions floated freely across the table. Decisions about schedules, visits, holidays. No one asked what I thought. No one even looked to see if I was listening. I noticed my place setting was different. The plate was smaller. The glass didn't match the others. I wondered when that had happened, and how many dinners it had taken before someone decided this was appropriate. Across the table, my son nodded along to something my daughter-in-law said. He smiled. He laughed softly. He didn't look at me once. I wanted to say something simple. Not dramatic, just a small question. "Is this seat okay?" But the words didn't come out, because asking would mean admitting that something had changed, and part of me wasn't ready to name it yet. I told myself it was practical. Maybe they needed space. Maybe I was in the way before and hadn't noticed. Maybe this was just one of those adjustments families make without announcements. Still, my hands felt numb. I folded the napkin again and again. The chair creaked slightly when I shifted my weight. No one turned around. From where I sat, I could see the table clearly, the shared dishes, the bread being passed, the easy rhythm of belonging. I wasn't part of that rhythm anymore. I realized then that no one had asked me to move. They hadn't said, "Would you mind sitting here?" They hadn't said, "Is this comfortable for you?" They had simply decided, "You can sit here." That was all. The words were calm, reasonable, almost kind, and yet they landed heavier than any insult I could remember, because there was no argument to respond to, no accusation to defend against, no raised voice to push back on, just a placement, a quiet one. I stayed seated for the rest of the meal. I didn't interrupt, I didn't complain, I didn't ask to be moved. I watched, I listened, I learned. By the time dessert was served, I understood something clearly, not intellectually, but in my body. I hadn't been pushed away, I had been put somewhere, and the most unsettling part wasn't that no one objected, it was that no one thought they needed to. There was a time when they used to ask me first, not because I demanded it, not because I insisted. They asked because it felt natural. "What do you think, Mom? Does this make sense to you? Should we do it this way?" Those questions used to come easily, casually, as if my presence belonged right in the middle of things. Family dinners were louder then, messier, chairs were pulled close together, conversations overlapped, and I had to raise my voice sometimes just to be heard, but I was heard. Back then, I didn't notice where I sat. I didn't need to. I was simply there. Somewhere along the way, that changed. At first, it was so small I almost felt silly noticing it. a conversation would start without me. Then someone would turn and say, "Oh, we'll tell Mom later." Later became the new normal. Plans were discussed quickly, then summarized for me in a sentence or two. Just enough information to sound respectful, not enough to invite a response. I told myself it was efficiency, that families evolve, that I didn't need to be involved in every detail. After all, my son had his own life now, his own household, his own rhythm. I didn't want to be the mother who hovered. I didn't want to be the one people whispered about. So when decisions were made without me, I smiled. When conversations moved on before I could speak, I stayed quiet. When I was told, "Mom won't mind," I made sure I didn't. That phrase came up more often than I expected. Mom won't mind if we eat earlier. Mom won't mind if we change plans. Mom won't mind sitting there. It was always said lightly, almost affectionately, as if my flexibility were a virtue, and I wanted to believe that it was. I told myself that being easygoing was a form of love, that stepping back meant I trusted them, that silence was maturity. Sometimes my son would glance at me, telling me things after the fact. His tone was gentle, apologetic even. "I figured you'd be okay with it." I nodded. I always nodded. Inside, something tightened, but I pushed it down. I reminded myself that I had raised him to be independent, that this was the result of doing my job well. I didn't want to undo that by suddenly asking for space at the table. So I adapted. I learned to listen more than I spoke, to wait for pauses that never came, to accept summaries instead of invitations. At family gatherings, I noticed I was often seated a little farther away than before, not excluded, just adjusted. Close enough to be included in photos, far enough to be out of the way. From where I sat, I could hear laughter clearly. I could see faces. I could follow the conversation, but I wasn't part of its flow. When I did speak, there was often a brief pause, not uncomfortable, just noticeable. Then the conversation moved on. No one was rude. No one was cruel. That made it harder to name what I was feeling. How do you complain about something no one admits they're doing? So I didn't. Instead, I told myself stories that made it easier to stay quiet. I told myself it was temporary, that this phase would pass, that once things settled down, my place would naturally return. I told myself it was temporary. I repeated that thought often, like a promise I didn't need anyone else to confirm. I reminded myself that families shift, that roles change, that being needed looks different as children grow older. I convinced myself that I was being sensitive, that noticing these things meant I was looking too closely, so I stopped looking. I focused on being agreeable, supportive, invisible in the ways that felt safest, because as long as no one pushed me away directly, I could pretend I hadn't moved at all. It wasn't one moment that changed everything. It was the pattern. Once I started noticing it, I couldn't stop. There were small signs at first, the kind that don't feel important enough to mention out loud, the kind you explain away before anyone else has the chance to. When plans were made, I heard about them last. When conversations drifted, they drifted away from me. When decisions were finalized, I was informed, politely, briefly, efficiently, always after. I noticed how often my name was used without my presence. "Mom's fine with it. Mom doesn't need to worry. Mom won't mind." It was said with certainty, as if I had already agreed, as if my consent had been quietly filed away somewhere without my signature. I tried to remember the last time someone had actually asked. Not informed, not reassured. Asked. The memory didn't come easily. At family gatherings, I found myself arriving already positioned on the edge of things, not physically excluded. No one ever blocked my way, but emotionally pre-assigned. There was a rhythm to the room that no longer included me. Laughter would swell, then dip. Inside jokes would pass between my son and my daughter-in-law, quick glances exchanged, decisions sealed with a look I wasn't part of. Sometimes I would start a sentence and stop halfway through, realizing no one was waiting for the end. I told myself that this was what independence looked like, that I should be proud. But pride doesn't usually feel this lonely. I watched how my daughter-in-law moved through the room, confident, efficient, always a step ahead of the conversation. She didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. She simply continued. When she spoke, the room adjusted around her. When I spoke, the room paused, just long enough to be polite. Then it continued without me. My son noticed sometimes. I could tell. There were moments when his eyes flickered toward me, hesitation passing over his face like a thought he chose not to finish. "Sorry, Mom," he would say occasionally. "We already talked about it." Already. That word settled heavily. I nodded, like I always did. I told him it was fine, that I trusted them, and I meant it, or at least I wanted to. Trust felt easier than confrontation. Silence felt safer than being labeled difficult. So I adjusted again. I stopped offering opinions unless directly asked. I learned to listen without leaning forward. I smiled at summaries. Inside, I kept telling myself the same thing. This is temporary. You're just in a quieter season. This doesn't mean anything. But the more I repeated those thoughts, the more they sounded like reassurance meant for a child. I started noticing the physical distance too. At the table, on the couch, in photos. I was never cropped out, just placed carefully at the edge, close enough to prove inclusion, far enough to avoid involvement. No one said I was in the way. No one had to. I began to feel tired in a way sleep didn't fix. A dull heaviness that followed me home after each visit. I would replay conversations in my head, searching for the moment I had been unnecessary. There were too many to count. One evening, after a particularly quiet dinner, I stood by the door, putting on my coat. Everyone was already talking about what came next, schedules, errands, plans that didn't involve me. No one noticed I was leaving. I paused, waiting for someone to look up, for someone to say my name. No one did. That was when it became harder to pretend this was accidental, because accidents happen once, patterns repeat, and this pattern didn't require my absence to continue. It worked just fine with me sitting there. I told myself one last time that it was temporary, that I was imagining it, that I was being sensitive. But the words felt thin. Something had shifted, not loudly, not suddenly, but decisively. And for the first time I wondered if my place in that room hadn't faded, if it had been quietly reassigned. It didn't happen all at once. It happened while I was sitting right there. Conversations began to feel staged, not rehearsed, just directed. The timing, the pauses, the way topics shifted whenever I leaned in slightly, as if the room itself had learned how to redirect me. They talked about plans in full sentences, clear, confident, finished. Then they turned to me and gave me the short version. "We already decided. We'll let you know. It's all handled." Handled. I noticed that word because it came up often. Always calm, always final. When decisions were made, they were discussed openly, just not with me. I would hear my name mentioned, followed by an assumption. "Mom will understand. Mom doesn't need to worry about this. Mom prefers not to be involved." No one checked if that was true. I started to realize I wasn't being ignored. I was being managed. The difference matters. Ignoring someone is careless. Managing someone is deliberate. My daughter-in-law had a way of guiding conversations without ever raising her voice. She didn't interrupt. She redirected. She didn't contradict. She reframed. When my son began to speak, she would finish his sentence. When someone asked a question, she answered before it reached me. The rhythm belonged to her. I watched how often she made eye contact with everyone except me, how she stood between conversations, subtly blocking lines of communication without appearing to do so. It was impressive in a way. Quiet control doesn't look like control. It looks like organization, and organization is hard to argue with. At the table, discussions moved quickly, decisions stacked neatly on top of each other. I noticed how my suggestions, when I offered them, were acknowledged but not adopted. "That's an idea," she would say. Then the conversation moved on. Not rejected, just bypassed. I began to pay attention to details I had once ignored. Who spoke first? Who ended discussions? Who summarized conclusions? It was almost always her. My son followed along easily. He trusted her flow. He nodded at the right moments. He deferred without realizing he was doing it. When I looked at him, really looked, I saw comfort, not malice. That made it harder. If there had been anger, I could have named it. If there had been cruelty, I could have confronted it. But this was something else. This was efficiency replacing inclusion. I noticed how I was positioned physically as well, not pushed away, just placed where interruption was unlikely. From my seat I could hear everything, I could see everyone, but joining required effort. And effort, I was learning, was something I was no longer expected to make. After one gathering, I realized I couldn't recall a single decision I had influenced that evening. Not one. Yet my presence had been acknowledged repeatedly. Are you comfortable? Do you need anything? Let us know if you're tired. Comfort had replaced contribution. I smiled through those questions. I answered politely. But inside, a quiet alarm began to sound. I started replaying conversations later, at home, trying to pinpoint the exact moment my role had changed. There wasn't one. That was the problem. Control had entered the room without announcing itself. I remembered a moment when my daughter-in-law leaned across the table and said something about the schedule for the coming months. She spoke confidently, outlining details with precision. When she finished, she glanced at me briefly. "You'll be fine with that, right?" It wasn't a question. It was a closing statement. I nodded. Again. Only later did I realize what had happened. My agreement had been assumed. My consent had been implied. My silence had been interpreted as approval. I began to understand the rules of this new arrangement. Speak too much and you disrupt the flow. Ask questions and you slow things down. Accept summaries and everything stays smooth. Smoothness had become the priority. I looked down at the table then, at my hands, at the way they rested quietly in my lap. No one noticed, and that's when the thought formed, not fully, not clearly, but enough to unsettle me. They talked about my life like I wasn't there. Once I began paying attention, the details stopped hiding. They were everywhere. It wasn't just what was said, it was what wasn't. The pauses that didn't invite me in, the glances exchanged before decisions were finalized, the way conversations flowed smoothly until I shifted in my seat. Then they adjusted. I noticed how often my daughter-in-law checked the room before speaking, as if gauging who needed to hear what. I noticed how she framed information, always as updates, never as questions. "We're doing this next month. This is already arranged. That part is taken care of." Taken care of by whom was never specified. When I asked small clarifying questions, the answers came quickly, wrapped in reassurance. "Don't worry about it. It's simpler this way. We didn't want to bother you." Bother. That word landed differently now. I began to realize that what they called consideration was actually containment, keeping me comfortable enough not to object, informed enough not to panic, detached enough not to interfere. At one gathering, I watched my daughter-in-law subtly shift the seating again, not dramatically, just enough so that conversations formed circles I wasn't part of. She didn't look at me when she did it. She didn't need to. Later, when I tried to join a discussion about plans for the coming weeks, my son responded gently, almost apologetically. "We already went over this." I searched his face for irritation. There was none, only certainty. That was when it became clear. This wasn't about excluding me emotionally, it was about streamlining. Including me slowed things down. I thought back to all the times I had been told, "Mom doesn't need to know the details." All the times decisions had been summarized instead of discussed. All the times my agreement had been assumed. It added up. The realization didn't come with anger. It came with clarity. I wasn't being forgotten. I was being positioned. I tested it once. Carefully. At the next dinner, when a decision was mentioned casually, I asked a simple question. Why? Not accusatory, not loud, just curious. The room shifted instantly. My daughter-in-law smiled, but her voice tightened slightly. She answered quickly, efficiently, before anyone else could speak. It's just how it works best. My son nodded. No further explanation followed. The conversation moved on. That was the moment I knew. Questions were no longer welcome. Information flowed one way. Decisions were delivered, not discussed. My role had been redefined without my participation. I started keeping quiet notes in my mind, not out of bitterness, out of necessity. Who spoke first? Who summarized last? Who closed conversations? Who was always answered? Who was always reassured? It was never me. I noticed how often my daughter-in-law spoke for me. Mom's okay with that. She doesn't need to come. She prefers to stay out of it. Each statement erased a small piece of me. I wondered how long this had been happening without my noticing, how easily silence becomes permission when no one challenges it. One evening, I sat there listening as plans were made about my schedule, days, visits, arrangements, all discussed in the third person. As if I weren't sitting at the table. As if my presence were symbolic, not functional. I looked down at my hands again, the same hands that had once been asked to weigh in, to decide, to lead. No one looked up. That's when the truth settled fully. They weren't excluding me because I was difficult. They weren't protecting me because I was fragile. They were controlling the space because it worked better that way, quietly, smoothly, efficiently. I realized then that this kind of control doesn't announce itself. It arrives wrapped in politeness. It thrives on the assumption that no one will question something that looks so reasonable. And I understood something else too. As long as I remained silent, this arrangement would continue, not because anyone meant harm, but because it was convenient. I didn't feel panicked. I felt alert. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't trying to explain anything away. I wasn't telling myself it was temporary. I was seeing it for what it was. They talked about my life like I wasn't there, and this time, I didn't look away. I wasn't meant to hear it. That was the part that stayed with me the longest. If she had said it to my face, I might have reacted, defended myself, asked questions, explained, but she didn't. I was standing near the window, pretending to be busy with something small, straightening a curtain, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the floor. I could hear voices behind me, low, casual, unguarded, the kind of voices people use when they believe no one important is listening. Someone laughed softly. Then my daughter-in-law spoke. "She's more comfortable staying out of the way." The words were said gently, almost kindly, as if she were describing a preference, not a position. No malice, no edge, just a statement of fact. I stayed still. For a moment, I thought I might have misheard, that maybe I had filled in the meaning myself. But then she continued, elaborating in the same calm tone. "It's easier for everyone. She doesn't really like being involved anyway." There it was, not an accident, not a misunderstanding, a conclusion. I felt something shift inside me, not sharply, not all at once, but deeply, like a piece of ground giving way after being stepped on too many times. I didn't turn around. I didn't make a sound. I didn't want them to know I had heard, because hearing it wasn't the most painful part. Understanding it was. I replayed the sentence in my mind, over and over. Each time it sounded less like an opinion and more like a justification. She's more comfortable staying out of the way. It explained everything, the seating, the summaries, the decisions made without me, the way conversations flowed around me instead of through me. This wasn't carelessness, it was design. I realized then that I hadn't been slowly fading into the background. I had been placed there, carefully, politely, strategically. The idea unsettled me more than any outright insult could have, because insults can be argued against, placements are harder to contest. I stood by the window longer than necessary, letting the realization settle. The light outside had softened, turning the room golden. Everything looked warm, peaceful. Inside, something very cold had just become clear. They didn't think they were doing anything wrong. In their minds, this arrangement worked. It kept things smooth, efficient, calm. It kept me from getting overwhelmed. It kept decisions uncomplicated. It kept control where it was easiest. I thought back to every time I had been told, "Don't worry about it." Every time my son had said, "It's already taken care of." Every time my agreement had been assumed. All of it fit neatly into this one sentence. She's more comfortable staying out of the way. It wasn't about my comfort at all. It was about theirs. I felt a quiet grief then, not for what I had lost, but for what I had misunderstood. I had believed I was stepping back out of love, out of trust, out of respect for their independence. But stepping back hadn't been enough. They needed me out of the way. The phrase echoed differently now. Out of the way of decisions, out of the way of conversations, out of the way of inconvenience. I finally turned from the window. No one noticed. The conversation behind me had already moved on. Laughter again. A new topic. The sentence that had changed everything left hanging in the air, unacknowledged. I sat down quietly, and for the first time, I didn't tell myself it was temporary. I didn't tell myself I was being sensitive. I didn't search for another explanation that would make it easier to swallow. I accepted what I had heard, not emotionally, not all at once, but clearly. They hadn't pushed me aside because they didn't care. They had placed me there because it worked better for them. And in that moment, standing alone by the window, listening to my life being summarized without me, I understood something that would change everything that came next. I wasn't invisible. I was inconvenient. I didn't confront her. That surprised me. For a brief moment, I imagined what it would sound like to step into the room and say her name, to repeat the sentence she had just spoken and ask her to explain it. But the urge passed. Not because I was afraid, because I finally understood something important. If I had spoken then, the conversation would have turned into reassurance, apologies, clarifications, softened words meant to smooth things over without changing anything. I didn't mean it that way. You're taking it too personally. We were just trying to help. I had heard those phrases enough times to know where they led, so I stayed quiet, not the quiet of avoidance, the quiet of recognition. I realized that this wasn't a misunderstanding to be cleared up. It was a system that had already been put in place, one that worked precisely because it didn't look cruel. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Being out of the way wasn't about where I sat. It was about where I belonged. They had created a version of me that fit neatly into their lives, a version that didn't ask questions, didn't complicate decisions, didn't require explanation, a manageable version. And the unsettling part was how easily I had slipped into that role. I had cooperated, not consciously, not deliberately, but every time I smiled instead of questioning, every time I nodded instead of asking why, every time I told myself not to be sensitive, I had helped shape this outcome. That realization didn't come with shame, it came with responsibility. I saw now that they weren't the only ones who had placed me somewhere. I had stayed there. I thought about all the times I had confused patience with acceptance, how often I had told myself that keeping the peace was more important than keeping my place. I had believed that love required flexibility, that respect came from being easy to accommodate, but what I was feeling now didn't resemble love or respect. It felt like erasure. Quiet, polite, well-intentioned erasure. Standing by the window earlier, listening to my life being summarized in a sentence, something inside me had shifted, not toward anger, toward clarity. I understood then that waiting to be invited back into the conversation wasn't going to work, because the conversation no longer required me. They had adjusted to my silence. That was the moment I stopped trying to reinsert myself, not dramatically, not publicly, internally. I stopped telling myself that I would be heard again if I just waited long enough. I stopped hoping someone would suddenly notice and correct the seating, the tone, the assumptions. Hope had kept me compliant. Understanding freed me. I returned to the table later and sat where I had been placed. I listened as before. I nodded when spoken to. I smiled at the right moments. But something had changed. I wasn't trying to belong there anymore. For the first time, I saw the situation clearly enough to step back without shrinking. Being out of the way had been presented as a kindness, a favor, a form of care. But care that requires you to disappear isn't care, it's convenience. And convenience, I realized, is never neutral. It always benefits someone. That afternoon, I didn't make any decisions. I didn't draw any boundaries. I didn't announce any changes. I simply allowed myself to see the truth without immediately trying to fix it. I let go of the version of myself who believed this was temporary. I let go of the idea that if I just stayed agreeable long enough, my place would naturally return. Places don't return on their own. They're either claimed or reassigned. As the evening ended, I gathered my things quietly. I said my goodbyes. I thanked everyone for dinner. No one noticed anything different, and that was enough confirmation. I walked out knowing one thing with certainty. I wasn't going to fight for space in a room that had learned how to function without me. I would choose a different kind of presence, one that didn't require permission. Nothing dramatic happened after that. There were no confrontations, no long conversations, no emotional speeches. I didn't announce any changes. I didn't explain myself. I didn't demand a seat at the table that no longer had room for me. I simply stopped doing certain things. I stopped showing up automatically. Before, I had gone whenever I was invited, and often when I wasn't. I had told myself that presence was proof of love, that availability was generosity. Now, I paused. When invitations came, I didn't rush to rearrange my day. I didn't cancel plans of my own. I didn't feel the need to justify a maybe. Sometimes I declined. Sometimes I arrived later. Sometimes I didn't come at all. And I didn't explain why. At first it felt uncomfortable, like I was breaking an unspoken rule. The old reflex to soften the change crept in. I just didn't want to bother you. I wasn't feeling well. Another time, maybe? I caught myself before the words left my mouth. I didn't owe an explanation for choosing myself, so I let the silence do the work. I noticed how much energy I had spent managing other people's comfort. How often I had smoothed things over before they even became uncomfortable. Without that constant effort, my days felt quieter, slower. I started choosing when to engage instead of reacting by default. When I was present on my terms. When I wasn't, I didn't fill the absence with apologies. I stopped offering opinions unless they were asked for, and even then I answered briefly, clearly, without elaboration, no more justifying, no more convincing, no more waiting for acknowledgement. I stopped explaining. I stopped waiting. That sentence became a quiet anchor. I noticed changes almost immediately, not in them, but in me. The tension I used to carry into every gathering wasn't there anymore. I wasn't scanning the room for cues. I wasn't measuring my words. I sat where I chose. I spoke when I wanted to. I left when I was ready. At home, I began to build a rhythm that didn't revolve around anyone else's schedule. Mornings were slower. I cooked meals I liked, not meals designed to accommodate preferences. I spent time on things I had postponed for years, always telling myself I'd get to them later. Later had arrived quietly. I rearranged my small dining table one afternoon, placing a single chair by the window. The light there was better, warmer. It felt intentional. Eating alone didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful. I realized then how rarely I had allowed myself that feeling. Being constantly available had left little room for presence. Stepping back created space I hadn't known I needed. I didn't disappear. I became selective. And selection, I was learning, is a form of respect. When my son called, I answered but I didn't rush. When he asked questions, I responded, but I didn't volunteer more than necessary. I kept my voice steady, neutral, kind, no accusations, no explanations, just clarity. If something didn't work for me, I said so, simply, without adding a reason that could be negotiated. I won't be able to. That doesn't work for me. Another time. Each sentence felt strange at first, then natural. I wasn't withdrawing out of spite. I wasn't trying to prove a point. I was reclaiming something quietly, control over my own presence. I didn't need them to notice yet. This wasn't about sending a message. It was about resetting my footing. I knew that real change wouldn't come from arguments or ultimatums. It would come from consistency, from choosing myself repeatedly, without drama, from letting go of the urge to be understood. That was the hardest part, because part of me still wanted someone to ask, "Are you okay?" To notice the shift, to acknowledge what had changed. But I resisted that impulse. Quiet justice doesn't announce itself. It unfolds. The first reaction didn't come as a confrontation. It came as confusion. At first, no one mentioned the change. Invitations still arrived, phrased the same way, as if nothing had shifted. "Dinner on Sunday? Are you coming by later?" When I didn't respond immediately, there was a pause, then a follow-up, then another. I replied calmly, briefly, sometimes yes, sometimes no. No explanations. That was new. I noticed the tone change before the words did. Messages became slightly more careful. Questions were repeated. Schedules were clarified in ways they hadn't been before. "Just checking." "Let us know." "We weren't sure." I let those messages sit for a while before answering, not to punish, to breathe. The space between messages felt like something adjusting itself, slowly, reluctantly. At the next family gathering I attended, I arrived later than usual. Not intentionally dramatic, just at a time that worked for me. When I walked in, the room was already in motion. Conversations were midstream, chairs were filled, no one pointed to a seat. I chose one myself. The chair I picked wasn't central. It wasn't hidden either. It was simply where I wanted to sit. I didn't ask. No one objected. That small moment told me more than any argument could have. I noticed my daughter-in-law watching me briefly. Not with hostility, with calculation. She wasn't sure what I would do next. That uncertainty was new. I spoke when I wanted to. I listened without leaning forward. When the conversation moved on, I didn't chase it. There was a moment when someone asked my opinion. Genuinely, I think. The question hovered in the air a second longer than usual. I answered simply. Then I stopped. I didn't elaborate. I didn't persuade. I didn't wait for approval. The room adjusted. After dinner, as people began clearing plates, my daughter-in-law said something casual. "You're leaving already?" Her tone was light, neutral. "Yes," I said. "I have an early morning." I didn't add anything else. She nodded. My son walked me to the door. He hesitated, as if there was something he wanted to say. He didn't. In the car, I noticed I wasn't replaying the evening in my head the way I used to. I wasn't scanning for missteps or moments I should have handled differently. I felt settled. That surprised me. The next few weeks followed the same pattern. My presence became intentional instead of automatic. I attended some things. I skipped others. I made plans that didn't revolve around family schedules. And slowly, the questions changed. Not accusations. Curiosity. "Is everything okay? You've been busy." "We don't see you as much," I answered honestly, without defensiveness. "I'm doing well." "I've been enjoying my time." "Yes. Things are good." No explanations. That was the part they seemed to struggle with most. They were used to reasons they could respond to, emotions they could soothe, concerns they could reframe, but contentment doesn't invite negotiation. I noticed how my daughter-in-law began offering small accommodations, a seat closer, a pause in conversation, a glance in my direction before decisions were finalized. Nothing dramatic, just adjustments. I didn't acknowledge them, not because I didn't notice, but because I didn't need to. Quiet justice doesn't require validation. What mattered was that I no longer felt the need to earn my place. I wasn't waiting to be included. I wasn't explaining myself back into relevance. I had stepped out of the role that had been written for me, and roles, once abandoned, don't hold power. One afternoon, as I sat at my small table by the window, light warming the surface in front of me, I realized something fundamental had changed. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing when to show up, choosing how long to stay, choosing what to share, and what to keep for myself. That choice created a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. The family hadn't fallen apart. No one had been hurt, No harsh words had been exchanged, but the balance had shifted, not because I demanded it, because I stopped accommodating a position that no longer respected me, and I knew then that the next step wouldn't be louder, it would be clearer. I didn't sit anyone down to talk. That would have turned it into a debate, a discussion, an opportunity for compromise I wasn't seeking. Boundaries don't need consensus, they need consistency. I waited for the next ordinary moment, not a crisis, not a confrontation, just a situation that used to pull me in automatically. An invitation arrived, phrased the way it always had been. "We're having dinner on Thursday." No question mark, no pause for input. I read it twice, then set the phone down. A few minutes later, I replied, "Thursday doesn't work for me." That was it. No apology, no explanation. The message sat there, simple and complete. A follow-up came quickly. "Oh, why?" I stared at the screen longer this time, feeling the familiar urge rise, the reflex to soften, to justify, to make my boundary easier to accept. I let it pass. "I won't be able to make it," I wrote. Nothing more. The silence that followed felt different from before, not empty, charged. When Thursday came, I didn't check my phone. I didn't imagine what they might be saying. I didn't fill the absence with guilt. I spent the evening at home, eating slowly, enjoying the quiet. The next invitation arrived a week later. This time it sounded different. "Would you like to come by on Sunday?" The question mark mattered. "Yes," I replied. "I'll come by in the afternoon." I arrived when I said I would. Not early, not late. When I walked in, there was a brief hesitation, the kind that comes when people realize the old pattern no longer applies. I didn't wait to be directed. I chose my seat. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't take the head of the table. I didn't retreat to the edge either. I sat where I could see everyone clearly, where my voice wouldn't need to compete to be heard. No one stopped me. That mattered too. I stayed as long as I wanted. When the conversation shifted into something I didn't care to be part of, I listened quietly, or I excused myself. "I'm going to step outside for a bit," I said at one point. No justification, no permission requested. I came back when I felt ready. Later, when plates were cleared and people lingered, my son asked me a question, a real one, not a summary, not an update. "What do you think?" I answered honestly, briefly. Then I stopped. I didn't fill the space with reassurance. I didn't circle back to make sure my opinion had landed softly. It was enough to say it. I noticed how my daughter-in-law watched me then, not closely, not suspiciously, but attentively. She was adjusting. That night, as I was leaving, my son walked me to the door. "You don't stay as long as you used to," he said. His tone wasn't accusatory, curious maybe, slightly uncertain. "I stay as long as I want to," I replied. I didn't wait to see how that landed. At home, I thought about how different it felt to say no without defending it, to choose my seat without explanation, to leave without asking if it was okay. There was no anger in me, no urge to prove a point, just clarity. Respect doesn't need permission. It doesn't arrive through arguments or emotional appeals. It shows up when you stop accepting less. I wasn't asking to be centered again. I wasn't demanding a role. I was setting terms. When I'm invited, I'll decide. When I'm present, I'll choose my place. When I'm done, I'll leave. No negotiations, no drama, just practice. I knew this would feel uncomfortable for them at first. Change always does, but discomfort isn't the same as harm. And my comfort mattered too. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't bracing myself before family gatherings. I wasn't rehearsing responses or preparing to disappear. I was simply showing up, or not, on my own terms. And that was the boundary. Boundaries are always tested. Not aggressively, not at first. They're tested quietly, the way people check whether a door is really locked or just resting against the frame. The first test came disguised as concern. My son called one afternoon, his voice careful. "You've changed," he said. "We just want to make sure everything's okay." I didn't rush to reassure him. "I'm okay," I replied. There was a pause, the kind that expects more. I didn't add anything. He tried again. "We just miss you." "I know," I said. Still nothing else. Silence stretched between us, unfamiliar and slightly uncomfortable. In the past, I would have filled it with explanations, promises, apologies. This time I let it be. The next test came as a suggestion. "We're thinking of doing dinner earlier next time," my daughter-in-law said during a visit. "That way it's easier for everyone." The phrasing was gentle, reasonable. I nodded once. "That won't work for me," I said. She blinked, then smiled. "Oh, we can figure something out." "Great," I replied, and left it there. I didn't propose alternatives, I didn't negotiate, I didn't volunteer solutions. The point wasn't to control the outcome, it was to make my boundary clear. After that, the adjustments became subtler. Invitations were phrased as questions instead of announcements. Schedules were shared instead of assumed. Decisions paused, just long enough, to see if I would speak. Sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. Either way, I didn't chase the conversation. At one gathering, I arrived to find my usual chair occupied. Not intentionally, I think, just habit. For a moment, no one moved. I scanned the room and chose another seat, one that worked for me. I sat down without comment. My daughter-in-law noticed. I could tell. She shifted slightly, as if deciding whether to say something. She didn't. That was progress. Later, during a discussion about plans, my name came up again. "Mom probably doesn't want to," I interrupted gently. "Please don't speak for me." The room went still. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sharp. It was calm. My daughter-in-law nodded once. "Okay." That was all. No argument followed. No justification was demanded. I didn't explain why I had said it. I didn't soften the moment. I didn't need to. That single sentence did more than any long conversation could have. From then on, when my opinion was wanted, I was asked directly. When it wasn't, I wasn't referenced at all. Both were acceptable. What mattered was the shift. I noticed how my son began looking at me again when decisions were discussed. Not out of obligation, out of awareness. I noticed how my daughter-in-law checked herself before summarizing things on my behalf. Not perfectly, not every time, but often enough to matter. There were moments of tension. Small ones, raised eyebrows, half-finished sentences. I let them pass. Boundaries don't require constant reinforcement when they're practiced consistently. At home, my sense of steadiness grew. I wasn't waiting to see how they would respond anymore. I wasn't measuring success by their comfort. I had already made my decision. I would no longer accept a role that required me to shrink. Not angrily, not dramatically, quietly. I understood now that respect isn't something you argue people into. It's something you demonstrate by what you tolerate and what you don't. The family didn't fracture. No one accused me of being difficult. No scenes were made. But something fundamental had shifted. They adjusted their expectations, and I adjusted nothing. That was the balance. I wasn't reclaiming my place at their table. I was reclaiming authority over myself. And once that line was drawn, calmly, clearly, without apology, there was no need to redraw it. They could step up to it, or not. Either way, I was no longer sitting where I had been placed. The chair stayed empty longer than anyone expected. At first, it didn't register as anything unusual. Chairs are empty all the time. People arrive late, people leave early. Absence, in small doses, is easy to dismiss. But this one lingered. At the next family dinner, I wasn't there. Not because I had made a point of it, not because anyone had told me not to come. I had simply chosen not to. The table was full. Plates passed from hand to hand. Conversations rose and fell like they always did. Everything looked the same, until it didn't. There was an extra chair. No one sat in it. At first, it went unnoticed. Then someone paused mid-sentence, eyes flicking toward the empty space before returning to the conversation. No comment followed. They continued eating. But the rhythm felt off. The chair remained empty through the entire meal. At another gathering, the same thing happened. This time, my son noticed. He glanced at the chair, then at his phone. Not long enough to be obvious, long enough to register. He didn't say anything. My absence didn't disrupt the event. It didn't stop plans from being made or conversations from unfolding. That wasn't the point. It changed the texture. There was less explaining, fewer pauses. Conversations ended sooner than usual, as if something had been left unresolved without anyone quite knowing why. I wasn't there to be summarized. I wasn't there to be reassured. I wasn't there to smooth things over. That quiet role I had once filled was suddenly vacant, and without it, the room felt sharper. I could imagine my daughter-in-law noticing too, not emotionally, but logistically. She was attuned to flow, to arrangement, to how scenes came together. An empty chair disrupts composition. She didn't mention me outright, not at first. Instead, she asked practical questions. What time did she say she'd come? Did she mention if she was busy? Questions that assumed my absence had an explanation she simply hadn't received yet. When my son shrugged, something shifted. She didn't say, he replied. That was new. Before, he always had an answer, an explanation ready, a reason that smoothed things over. This time, there wasn't one. At another dinner, the empty chair was moved slightly closer to the table, as if testing whether the space could be reclaimed by proximity alone. No one sat there. Someone suggested rearranging the seating. It might be easier this way, my daughter-in-law said lightly. But the adjustment didn't fix the feeling. The chair was still empty. I wasn't there to fill the gaps in conversation or absorb the edges of discomfort. I wasn't there to nod along or reassure anyone that everything was fine. The silence I left behind wasn't loud. It was noticeable. My son began to mention me more often, not with irritation, not with accusation, but with uncertainty. She didn't say anything. I thought she might come. I'm not sure. Each statement carried a small weight. The certainty he had once relied on, the assumption that I would show up, adapt, adjust, was gone. That certainty had made things easy. Without it, he had to notice the absence, instead of explaining it away. My daughter-in-law noticed too, in her own way. She was used to arranging the room, physically and conversationally. She knew where everyone belonged, where conversations flowed best. An unfilled space resists arrangement. I could imagine her irritation, not because she missed me, but because the picture no longer aligned the way she wanted it to. A missing element disrupts control. No one accused me of anything, no one called, no one demanded explanations, but the absence had begun to speak, not in words, in pauses, in glances, in the way conversations no longer landed quite right. They noticed the silence I left behind, and for the first time, it wasn't something they could manage with efficiency or reassurance. It simply sat there, unfilled. The absence didn't stay neutral for long. At some point, it stopped being an empty chair and became a question no one wanted to ask out loud. My son felt it first. Not dramatically, not all at once. It showed in small hesitations, in the way he lingered before speaking, in the way his eyes searched the room when conversations stalled. He began checking his phone more often during gatherings, as if expecting a message that would explain everything. She didn't say she wasn't coming, he mentioned once, almost to himself. No one answered. That uncertainty unsettled him more than my presence ever had. Before, I had been predictable, available, easy to place. Even when I wasn't central, I was reliable. Now, I wasn't. That reliability had been quietly carrying weight. Without it, my son had to sit with something unfamiliar, the realization that not everything could be assumed. I noticed the change in his tone when he called me later that week. "You've been busy," he said. Not a question, not an accusation, an observation. "Yes," I replied. "I have." There was a pause. He waited for more. I didn't add anything. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay," he said finally. "I am," I answered, and I meant it. He didn't push, but he didn't sound relieved either. Something had shifted between us, not affection, not care, but expectation. He no longer knew where to place me. That discomfort followed him into the room when I wasn't there. My daughter-in-law reacted differently. Where my son felt uncertainty, she felt disruption. She was used to controlling the flow, the pacing of meals, the arrangement of seats, the tone of conversations. She noticed when something didn't align the way it was supposed to. An empty chair isn't just empty, it interrupts symmetry. At the next gathering, she tried to compensate. She filled the space with activity. More conversation, more direction. She spoke a little louder, moved a little faster, as if energy could replace absence. At one point, she suggested rearranging the table again. "Let's just move things around a bit," she said, smiling tightly. No one objected, but even rearranged, the space didn't resolve. The absence had weight now. I wasn't there to absorb tension or smooth transitions. I wasn't there to quietly step aside when conversations became crowded. That role, the one I had filled without being asked, was suddenly unoccupied, and without it, the edges of the room felt sharper. My daughter-in-law began asking questions she hadn't needed to ask before. Did she say anything? Did you talk to her? Does she seem upset? Each question was framed as concern, but beneath it was something else, a lack of control. She was used to understanding the full picture: who would be present, how long they would stay, where they would sit. My absence introduced an unknown variable. Unknowns don't cooperate. I imagined her frustration, not because she missed me, but because she couldn't manage what she couldn't predict. Control depends on consistency, and consistency was gone. At one dinner, my son mentioned me directly. "She usually helps with this part," he said, gesturing vaguely. The comment hung in the air. It wasn't a complaint, it wasn't praise, it was acknowledgement. Something small had been missing, and only now was it being named. My daughter-in-law responded quickly, "It's fine, we've got it." Her voice was firm, final, but the ease she usually carried wasn't there. The silence I left behind wasn't emotional. It was functional. I had been filling gaps no one realized existed until they were empty. I wasn't there to bridge moments of awkwardness. I wasn't there to translate moods. I wasn't there to soften edges. Without that, the family dynamic had to adjust. And adjustment brings friction. No one blamed me. That was the strange part. There were no accusations, no dramatic conversations, no declarations of hurt. Just a growing awareness that something had changed and couldn't be restored by pretending it hadn't. I knew then that my absence was doing exactly what my presence never could. It was making the invisible visible. They noticed the silence I left behind, and this time they couldn't rearrange the room to hide it. The question came quietly, not in anger, not as an accusation. It came in the way people ask when they already sense the answer might unsettle them. We were sitting together for the first time in a while, not at a crowded table, not during a busy gathering, just a small, ordinary moment that didn't look important enough to change anything. My son cleared his throat. "Did we do something wrong?" The room felt still immediately, not tense, attentive. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, because I knew exactly what not to say. I wasn't going to list examples. I wasn't going to revisit old moments. I wasn't going to explain myself into a corner. Those explanations had never changed anything before. So I took a breath. I noticed how my daughter-in-law leaned slightly forward, as if preparing to respond or intercept. I noticed how my son's shoulders tensed, waiting. They were bracing for emotion. I didn't give them any. "I didn't leave," I said calmly. The words landed softly, incomplete. I could feel the room waiting for the rest, the reasons, the stories, the emotional weight they could work with. I didn't rush. I was placed somewhere I didn't belong. That was all. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full. No one spoke immediately. No one rushed to fill the space with reassurances or defenses. My daughter-in-law's mouth opened slightly, then closed. She looked at my son. He looked down at his hands. I could see the words forming in their minds. Explanations, intentions, justifications, all the things people reach for when confronted with something they hadn't planned to examine. I didn't interrupt that process. I didn't add anything, because adding would have turned the moment into a discussion. a negotiation, a chance to reframe my experience into something more comfortable. I had said what needed to be said. The sentence didn't accuse, it didn't attack, it didn't demand agreement. It simply named the truth. I didn't leave. I was placed somewhere I didn't belong. That truth didn't require a response, it required recognition. My son looked up then, his expression uncertain, not defensive, not angry, searching. "I didn't realize," he said quietly. I nodded once. I didn't say, "You should have." I didn't say, "How could you not?" Realization doesn't need punishment to be real. My daughter-in-law shifted in her seat. She smiled briefly, the kind of smile people use when they're trying to regain control of a moment that isn't moving the way they expected. "We were just trying to make things easier," she said. I didn't respond, not because I disagreed, because responding would have invited the familiar loop. I wasn't there to argue intentions. I was there to stand in my experience without explaining it away. The silence returned. This time it was heavier, not with guilt, with awareness. My son swallowed. "I didn't think it mattered," he said. "It did," I replied. Just 2 words. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't soften it either. The conversation could have gone in many directions after that. Apologies, defenses, promises. None of them came. And that was fine. For the first time, I wasn't measuring the success of the moment by how they reacted. I wasn't waiting for validation. I had already done what I needed to do. I had spoken once, clearly, calmly, without explanation. I didn't need them to agree. I didn't need them to apologize. I needed them to hear me. The room stayed quiet a moment longer. Then someone changed the subject, and life moved on. But something fundamental had shifted. Not because of volume, not because of emotion, because a boundary had been stated and left standing. No one rushed to fix it. That surprised me more than anything else. After the conversation shifted, the room filled again with ordinary sounds, a cup placed on the table, a chair scraping softly against the floor, someone asking if anyone wanted more tea. Life resumed, but it didn't settle the way it used to. I could feel the sentence I had spoken still present, suspended somewhere between us, not heavy, not loud, just there. I didn't leave. I was placed somewhere I didn't belong. It wasn't being argued with. It wasn't being denied. It was being processed. My son spoke less after that. When he did, he chose his words carefully, as if noticing their weight for the first time. He didn't rush to reassure me. He didn't try to undo the moment with promises. That restraint mattered. It told me he was listening instead of reacting. My daughter-in-law responded differently. She became quieter, but not softer, more deliberate, as if she were recalibrating her role in a scene that had changed without warning. She didn't apologize. I hadn't expected her to. Apologies are often offered to end discomfort, not to acknowledge truth. And I wasn't looking for comfort. I was looking for clarity. In the days that followed, there were no dramatic follow-ups, no emotional phone calls, no long messages explaining intentions. There were small shifts instead. Invitations arrived phrased with more care. Questions were asked instead of assumptions made. Pauses appeared in conversations, brief moments where my presence was acknowledged rather than worked around. Not consistently, not perfectly, but enough to notice. I didn't comment on the changes. I didn't thank anyone for them. Boundaries don't need applause. What mattered was that I didn't feel the urge to adjust myself back into the old shape. I wasn't scanning for signs of acceptance anymore. I wasn't measuring progress by how included I felt. I had already moved past that. When I visited again, I chose my seat without hesitation. I didn't wait to be directed. I didn't look for permission. No one stopped me. At one point, my son asked my opinion directly, not as a formality, not as a gesture. He listened to the answer. That was enough. I noticed my daughter-in-law watching, not intervening. She didn't summarize for me. She didn't redirect the conversation. She let it unfold. That, too, was enough. Later, as I was leaving, my son walked me to the door. He stood there a moment longer than usual. "I didn't see it before," he said. I didn't ask what he meant. I do now. I nodded. There was no satisfaction in that moment, no sense of victory, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had been recognized. Recognition doesn't erase the past, it doesn't restore what was lost, but it changes what comes next. I drove home that evening without replaying the conversation in my head. I didn't wonder if I had said too much or too little. I had said exactly what was necessary. And then I had stopped. That was the difference. For so long, I had believed that being heard required repetition, explanation, emotional labor. I had believed that clarity came from saying more, but clarity, I was learning, often comes from saying less and standing still. I didn't expect things to be perfect now. I didn't expect everyone to suddenly understand. Understanding isn't required for boundaries to hold, only respect is. And respect, I realized, doesn't always arrive with warmth or agreement. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the way people adjust their behavior when they realize something fundamental has changed. That night, as I sat alone at my table by the window, the light fading gently outside, I felt something settle inside me. Not relief, not triumph, alignment. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't trying to reclaim a place that had already passed. I had created a new one, not in their home, not at their table, but within myself. And that place didn't require anyone else to understand it. Mornings became my favorite again, not because anything extraordinary happened, but because nothing demanded my attention the moment I woke up. No schedule to adjust to, no conversation to prepare for, no quiet anxiety about whether I would be welcome or merely tolerated. I woke when my body felt ready. I moved slowly through the house, letting the day open instead of chasing it. I sat on the porch with my coffee as the sky shifted from pale gray to soft gold. The world felt unhurried there, honest. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't bracing myself for the day. I wasn't anticipating anyone else's needs before my own. That felt like freedom. My life didn't change dramatically. I didn't move away. I didn't cut anyone off. I didn't rebuild myself into someone unrecognizable. I simply stopped arranging my life around being acceptable. I went where I wanted to go. I stayed home when I wanted quiet. I filled my days with small routines that belonged only to me. A walk in the afternoon, a book left open on the table, meals eaten slowly, without conversation looping endlessly in my head. I noticed how calm had returned to my body before it returned to my thoughts. I wasn't replaying moments anymore. I wasn't correcting myself after conversations that no longer happened. That constant inner commentary, the one that asks, "Was that okay? Did I say too much? Did I say enough?" had gone quiet. I realized how much energy it had taken to live on the edge of other people's comfort. Without that drain, there was room again. Room to think, room to feel, room to exist without explanation. When I saw my family, it was different now. Not colder, not warmer either. Clearer. I arrived when I said I would. I left when I was ready. I chose where I sat. I spoke when I had something to say. And when I didn't, I was still complete. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't measuring whether I was being included enough. Inclusion had stopped being the goal. Peace had taken its place. I noticed that conversations felt lighter when I wasn't carrying them. That silences didn't frighten me anymore. That I could let moments pass without filling them. There was dignity in that. I thought about the woman I had been before, the one who stayed quiet to keep the peace, who folded herself smaller so others wouldn't feel inconvenienced. I didn't judge her. She had done what she thought love required, but love that asks you to disappear isn't love. It's accommodation. And accommodation, when it costs you yourself, becomes something else entirely. I hadn't reclaimed a role in my family. I had reclaimed myself. That distinction mattered. I no longer needed to be central to feel whole. I no longer needed approval to feel steady. I had stopped negotiating my worth. Some days I was invited. Some days I wasn't. Some days plans changed without me. None of it unsettled me. because my life no longer depended on being placed correctly in someone else's picture. I had learned something quietly late in life, but deeply. Belonging doesn't come from fitting into a space someone else assigns you. It comes from standing comfortably in the one you choose. As the sun rose higher, warming the porch where I sat, I felt a calm certainty settle in me. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for my place to be restored. I had already taken my seat. I didn't wake up one day feeling triumphant. There was no moment where everything suddenly made sense. What I felt instead was something quieter, a steady ease that followed me through the day, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but stays. I noticed it in the way I moved through ordinary moments, answering the phone without hesitation, saying no without rehearsing it first, sitting in silence without feeling the need to justify it. These were small things, almost unremarkable, and yet they felt like proof. I had stopped asking myself where I belonged. That question had shaped so much of my life without my realizing it. Where do I fit? Where should I sit? How much space am I allowed to take? Letting go of that question felt like setting something down I had been carrying for years. When I thought about my family now, the emotions were softer, less sharp, less urgent. I didn't need them to understand my choices. I didn't need them to validate the way I had changed. Understanding is comforting, but it isn't necessary. I had learned that peace doesn't come from being accepted. It comes from being aligned. Aligned with what feels honest, aligned with what feels respectful, aligned with the version of myself that no longer disappears to make room for others. I still cared. That hadn't changed. But care no longer meant constant availability. It no longer meant folding myself smaller or stepping aside without being asked. It meant showing up when it felt right and staying away when it didn't. That balance felt natural now. I thought about all the women who might recognize themselves in this story, women who have been placed gently, politely, into corners of their own lives, women who were never pushed, just slowly repositioned, not out of cruelty, not out of malice, but out of convenience. If there's one thing I wish I had known earlier, it's this: you don't have to be loud to be whole, you don't have to be angry to be firm, and you don't have to be chosen to choose yourself. There is dignity in quiet decisions. There is strength in stepping back without bitterness. There is freedom in realizing that you don't need to earn a place that should never have been taken from you. I still sit at tables, just not every table, and when I do, I choose my seat. That choice, simple, unremarkable, entirely mine, changed everything. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, you're not alone. Maybe you've felt that subtle shift, the way your voice slowly became optional, the way your presence was acknowledged but no longer required. If so, I hope you know this. You don't have to fight your way back in. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is step out and build something quieter, truer, on your own terms. For the first time, I chose my own seat, and I stayed there.